Aunt suddenly appeared after 30 years of absence and claimed that the parents' house should be sold because it belongs only to her. My father was furious, and then, when my grandfather passed away, it wasn't just the end of a life, but the beginning of a strange and painful chapter for our family. I'm Aaron Grant, and as the eldest son, I've always felt responsible for my family in a way that only the firstborn can. Losing Grandpa hit us all hard, especially my dad, David Grant. Grandpa had been the cornerstone of our family, a quiet, steady presence who kept us grounded. But his death brought more than just grief. It brought back something we never expected. My dad's sister, Lily Grant. Lily disappeared from our lives when she was just 18 years old, back in 1985. I'd only heard bits and pieces about her growing up, always whispered and never discussed openly. She had been rebellious, they said, full of fire and headstrong. I remember overhearing my parents late at night, talking about how Lily broke their mother's heart by leaving, how she was, just like her father, stubborn and selfish. No one had seen or heard from her in nearly 30 years. For a while, I think my dad even believed she was dead. But Lily showed up at our doorstep not long after we'd moved my grandma Marjorie into our home. After Grandpa died, Grandma couldn't live alone anymore. She was frail, her memory slipping, and she needed someone to look after her. Dad suggested that we rent out her house to help with expenses, and it seemed like a good plan. We were just starting to settle into a new routine when one rainy afternoon, Lily came knocking. I remember that day clearly. The sky was dark, thunder rumbling in the distance. I was in the kitchen, helping Grandma with her medication, when I heard the knock. I figured it was one of our neighbors, but when I opened the door, there she was, Lily Grant, my dad's long-lost sister, standing on our doorstep, soaked from the rain but wearing an almost defiant expression. "Hi, Aaron," she said, as if she'd been there just yesterday, as if we weren't practically strangers. I must have looked dumbfounded because she laughed, brushing past me into the hallway. Can I help you?" I finally managed, still processing the fact that I was face-to-face with a woman I'd only seen in old family photos. "Is David home?" she asked, looking around like she owned the place. Before I could respond, Dad appeared. Having heard the commotion, his face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Lily," he said, barely above a whisper. "Long time no see, big brother," she replied, smirking. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I could sense the tension between them, thick and almost suffocating. Finally, Dad broke the silence, stepping back to let her in. They moved into the living room, and I followed, curious but wary. Grandma, who had been dozing in her chair, woke up and gasped when she saw Lily. "Lily, oh my goodness, is it really you?" she cried, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's me, Mom," Lily replied, her voice softer now. She knelt beside Grandma's chair, and for a moment, I saw a flash of genuine emotion. It was hard not to feel a twinge of sympathy, watching them reunite after all these years. But that sympathy quickly faded as Lily's true intentions became clear. After the initial reunion, she wasted no time getting down to business. "So," she said, looking at Dad, "what's happening with the house? I heard you rented it out." Dad's expression hardened. "Yes, we did. Mom needed to be here, where we could take care of her. The rent helps cover the expenses." Lily leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, I think it's time we sold it. I could use the money." The room fell silent. I could feel the air shift as Dad clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You think you're entitled to the house after all these years?" Lily shrugged. "I'm still part of this family, whether you like it or not. And legally, I have just as much right to the house as you do." Dad stood up, his face flushed. "You left, Lily. You abandoned us. You didn't care about Mom or Dad, or any of us, for that matter. And now you show up, expecting us to hand over everything?" Lily met his gaze, unflinching. "I had my reasons for leaving, and I don't owe you any explanations. All I know is, I'm here now, and I need that money. I've gotten into a bit of trouble, and selling the house would solve a lot of problems for me." Grandma looked back and forth between them, her face etched with confusion and sorrow. "Please, both of you, let's not argue," she whispered, clutching the blanket draped over her lap. But Dad was too far gone. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving Lily's. "The answer is no. That house is for Mom's care, and it's not going anywhere. You can't just walk back into our lives and make demands." Lily's eyes narrowed. "You can't stop me, David. I have rights too, and I'll do whatever it takes to get what I'm owed." She stood up, brushing off her coat, and with one last icy glare, she walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I looked at Dad, trying to process what had just happened. I'd never seen him so angry, so full of resentment. It was like years of buried emotions had been brought to the surface, and there was no way to put them back. Over the next few days, Lily's words lingered like a dark cloud over our household. Grandma was visibly shaken, her health deteriorating as the stress took its toll. I could see the worry lines deepen on Dad's face as he tried to comfort her, assuring her that everything would be okay. But I wasn't so sure. One evening, I found Dad sitting alone in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. "Do you think she'll go through with it?" I asked, sitting down across from him. He looked up, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know, Aaron, but I won't let her take everything. Not after all we've been through." I nodded, sensing the weight of his words. Lily's return had thrown our family into chaos, reopening old wounds we'd thought were long healed. And the worst part was, I knew this was just the beginning. Lily wasn't the type to give up easily. She'd made it clear that she was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted, and I had no doubt she would follow through on her threats. In the weeks that followed, Lily continued to press her claim. She made phone calls, sent letters, even tried to enlist other family members to support her. But Dad stood firm, refusing to back down. The tension in our home grew unbearable, each day bringing a new confrontation, a new argument, a new reminder of the fractures in our family. Then, one morning, tragedy struck. I found Grandma slumped in her chair, her breathing shallow and labored. We rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. She passed away that afternoon, her body finally giving in to the strain of a broken heart. We were devastated, and as we stood by her bedside, the reality of our loss washed over us like a tidal wave. At the funeral, Lily showed up unannounced. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as we laid Grandma to rest. When it was over, she approached us, her face a mask of defiance. "This is on you, David," she said, her voice cold and accusing. "You pushed her to this. You wouldn't listen, wouldn't compromise. Now she's gone, and it's all because of you." Dad's face went pale, but he said nothing, his grief and anger too overwhelming for words. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she had no right to blame him, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I stood there, watching as she walked away, her parting words hanging heavy in the air. "This is only the beginning," she called over her shoulder. "I'll get what I'm owed, one way or another." As I watched her disappear into the distance, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that our battle with Lily was far from over, and that she wouldn't stop until she had torn our family apart completely. But I also knew that my father wouldn't give in without a fight. We had already lost too much, and we weren't about to let her take anything more. Lily's return had stirred up a storm that none of us were prepared for, and the atmosphere at home grew heavier by the day. My father, David, was angry, sure, but there was something else in his eyes whenever he talked about Lily, something that looked like guilt. I couldn't understand it at first, but as I listened to him talk about their childhood, the stories hinted at the cracks that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. Dad confided in me one evening, a couple of weeks after Grandma's funeral. We were sitting out on the porch, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. He stared out at the trees, his face drawn and tired. "Lily was wild even when we were kids," he said, almost to himself. "She'd run off for days at a time. She was just restless. I guess we all hoped she'd grow out of it, that she'd find something to keep her grounded, but she never did. And then, one day, she just disappeared. Left a note saying she had to find herself, or some nonsense like that. I nodded, trying to imagine the sister he described. I'd always seen Lily as a stranger, someone distant and detached from our family. But Dad's stories painted a picture of a young woman who was both daring and selfish, a person who wanted everything but couldn't decide what that was. What happened when she left? I asked, curious about what she'd done that was so unforgivable. He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. We searched for her, of course. I remember Dad spending nights out, driving from town to town, looking for any trace of her. Mom took it the hardest, though. I think she blamed herself, thought she'd failed somehow. But eventually, we had to accept that she was gone. And I had to step up. I was the only one left. It was the first time I'd seen him look vulnerable, and it made me feel protective of him. I hated Lily for making him feel this way, for coming back after all these years and ripping open old wounds just to satisfy her own greed. But that wasn't the end of it. With Grandma gone, Lily's demands only grew bolder. She showed up at the house again, uninvited, strutting in like she owned the place. Dad met her in the living room, his face hard as stone, but I could see the tension in his posture. He was trying to keep it together, but Lily had a way of getting under his skin. "So, have you come to your senses yet?" she asked, lounging in a chair like she didn't have a care in the world. "Because I'm not going away, David. I deserve that house just as much as you do. More, actually, since I'm the one who needs it." Dad clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "You've got some nerve, Lily. You think you can just waltz back into our lives and take whatever you want? It doesn't work like that. Mom didn't want you to have anything, and you know it." Lily's smile faltered, just for a second, but then she shrugged. She didn't know what she wanted. And anyway, she's not here to argue, is she? That house is worth something, and I plan to get my share. What share? Dad's voice was low, dangerous. You walked away from this family. You didn't even come back for Dad's funeral. You don't get to claim anything now. Lily's eyes narrowed, and I could see the cold calculation in her gaze. I'm not asking, David. I have a right to that house, and I will get what's mine, one way or another. Before Dad could respond, she turned and walked out, leaving a chill in the air. I watched him stand there, shoulders tense, his face a mixture of anger and frustration. I knew that if it were up to him, he'd kick her out and be done with it. But it wasn't that simple. Lily was right about one thing. Legally, she did have a claim, and she wasn't going to let us forget it. As the days passed, the situation only got worse. Lily started showing up more frequently, dropping by unannounced, and making a scene whenever she didn't get what she wanted. She even tried to enlist the support of other relatives, spinning stories about how she'd been wronged and how she was only asking for what was rightfully hers. But most people saw through her act. They knew what kind of person she was, and they wanted no part of it. Then, one day, Lily tried to turn me against my father. She cornered me in the hallway, her eyes flashing with a strange intensity. "Aaron," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You're a smart kid. You know your father isn't perfect. He's made mistakes, just like everyone else. You really think he has your best interests at heart?" I glared at her, the anger bubbling up inside me. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on," she said, rolling her eyes. "You really believe he's doing all of this for your sake? He's trying to keep everything for himself, just like he always has. I'm the only one who can see that this family is rotten from the inside out, and I'm the only one willing to do something about it." I clenched my fists, barely able to keep my voice steady. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Dad's done nothing but hold this family together while you were off doing who knows what. You don't get to come back here and act like you care." Lily sneered, stepping closer. "You're just like him, you know that? Blind and loyal to a fault. One day, you'll see that I'm right. And when you do, I'll be the only one left standing." She walked away, leaving me shaking with anger. I knew she was trying to manipulate me, trying to turn me against my own father. But I wasn't going to let her. I knew what kind of person she was, and I wasn't about to fall for her lies. In the end, it was Grandma who paid the price. The stress of it all took a toll on her health, and one night, she simply faded away. I'll never forget the sight of Dad standing by her bedside, his face pale and drawn as he held her hand for the last time. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the sense that somehow this was all his fault. At the funeral, Lily was there, of course. She stood at the back, watching as we laid Grandma to rest. When it was over, she approached Dad, her face a mask of anger and accusation. "This is on you, David," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "If you'd just listened, if you'd just given me what I asked for, she might still be here." Dad's face went white, his hands trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "How dare you?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're the one who drove her to this. You're the one who couldn't let things go." Lily laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? But you're no better than I am. You're just a coward, hiding behind your self-righteousness. Well, this is only the beginning. You're going to pay for what you've done." She walked away, leaving us standing there in the cemetery, her words hanging in the air like a curse. I looked at Dad, saw the devastation in his eyes, and I knew that she'd struck a nerve. But I also knew that he wouldn't let her win. He would fight, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, we tried to move on, but Lily's threats lingered, a dark cloud over our heads. Dad and I sat down to talk, and he made it clear that he wasn't going to let her take the house, no matter what. He hired a lawyer and began preparing for a legal battle, determined to protect what was left of our family's legacy. But Lily wasn't done yet. She made sure to remind us, in her own twisted way, that this wasn't over. She sent letters, left messages, always hinting that she had something more planned, something that would tear us apart. I could feel the tension building, like a storm about to break, and I knew that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. After Grandma passed, we were all devastated. The house felt emptier, colder, without her warmth to hold it together. But in the midst of our grief, Lily wasn't finished. Barely a week after the funeral, she showed up again, this time armed with a new weapon, a document that she claimed was Grandma's last will. She cornered us in the living room one evening, dropping the stack of papers on the coffee table with a smug smile. "What's this?" Dad asked, eyeing her warily. "Grandma's will," she replied, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "Turns out, she wanted me to have the house and all of her savings. She must have come to her senses before she passed." Dad's face turned ashen. "What are you talking about? Mom would never have left everything to you. She knew what you were like." Lily shrugged, leaning back in her chair. "Well, it's all here in black and white. I spoke to her lawyer, Jonathan Carter, and he confirmed it. Looks like I'm the sole beneficiary." I grabbed the papers, scanning through the lines, my heart pounding. It looked real enough, with signatures and legal jargon that I didn't fully understand. But something about it felt off. Grandma had never mentioned changing her will. In fact, she'd been clear in the past that she wanted everything to go to Dad and us grandkids. This didn't make sense. "Let me see that," Dad said, taking the papers from me. He read through it quickly, his brow furrowing. "This isn't right. Mom wouldn't have done this." Lily just smiled, crossing her arms. "Believe what you want, but the will stands. I'm the legal heir now, and I'm entitled to everything." Dad stood up, towering over her, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can just come in here, forge a document, and take everything? You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to let you get away with this." Lily remained unfazed, almost amused. "Go ahead, challenge it. But I've got Jonathan on my side, and he's already filed it with the court. There's nothing you can do to stop me." I could see the frustration in Dad's eyes, the helpless rage that comes when you know you're being cheated but can't immediately prove it. Lily had planned this well, manipulating the system to her advantage, and she was banking on the fact that we wouldn't be able to fight back. But she didn't count on Dad's determination. The next day, Dad wasted no time in hiring a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Linda Torres, who immediately got to work on our case. She had the will examined by a handwriting expert who confirmed what we already suspected. The signature was a forgery, but proving that in court would be another matter. Lily had done her homework, and she wasn't going to back down easily. Linda suggested we dig deeper, starting with Jonathan Carter, the executor of the will. He was a small-town lawyer with a good reputation, but something about his involvement felt wrong. Why would he agree to oversee such a suspicious document? It didn't add up. We hired a private investigator, Mark Dawson, to look into Jonathan's background and his connection to Lily. After a week of digging, he came back with the breakthrough we needed. Jonathan has a gambling problem, Mark told us, laying out his findings on the table. He's in deep, with debts to some pretty dangerous people. Turns out, Lily paid off a chunk of his debt right before the will was filed. Looks like he was desperate enough to do whatever she wanted. I felt a surge of relief, mixed with anger. So, this was how she'd managed to pull it off, by preying on someone's weakness. But we weren't done yet. We needed to get Jonathan to admit to the forgery, to crack under pressure. Only then could we expose Lily's scheme and take back what was rightfully ours. Linda arranged for a meeting with Jonathan, hoping to catch him off guard. We sat down in a dimly lit conference room, the air thick with tension. Dad and I were there, along with Linda, who wasted no time in laying out the evidence. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice cold and precise. "We have reason to believe that the will you filed on behalf of Lily Grant is a forgery. We also know about your recent financial transactions, including a substantial payment from Ms. Grant just before the will was submitted." Jonathan shifted in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't know what you're talking about. The will is legitimate." Linda leaned forward, her gaze unrelenting. "We've already spoken to the handwriting expert. It's only a matter of time before the court reaches the same conclusion. Do you really want to go down with Lily? Or would you rather cooperate and cut a deal?" Jonathan's face turned pale, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. I could see the fear in his expression, the realization that his scheme was falling apart. After a long silence, he finally cracked. "Okay, fine," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "She paid me. She said she'd take care of my debts if I forged the will. I didn't have a choice." Dad let out a breath, relief washing over him. But there was still work to be done. Jonathan's confession was a step forward, but we needed him to testify in court. He agreed, in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Linda assured him she'd do her best to keep him out of prison. The trial was tense, a spectacle that drew attention from the entire town. Lily showed up every day, dressed in designer clothes, looking smug and confident. But as the evidence piled up, her facade began to crack. Jonathan took the stand, confessing to the forgery and detailing Lily's role in the scheme. I watched her face as he spoke, saw the anger and desperation in her eyes. She knew she was losing. Finally, it was Dad's turn to testify. He spoke about Grandma, about her love for her family, and the heartbreak she endured when Lily left. His words were raw and filled with emotion, painting a picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her children, only to be betrayed in the end. Lily's defense was weak, a desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. She claimed she'd only wanted what was fair, that she was entitled to her share. But the jury saw through her lies, saw her for what she really was, a manipulative, self-serving woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. In the end, the verdict was clear: guilty. Lily was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and forgery, a punishment that felt both satisfying and sad. I had hoped, somewhere deep down, that she might show some remorse, that she might realize the pain she'd caused. But as she was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at us, her eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this, all of you." I knew that she meant it, that she would hold on to her anger, feeding on it like a fire. But I also knew that we had done the right thing, that we had protected Grandma's legacy and defended our family's honor. Jonathan received a suspended sentence, thanks to his cooperation. He was a broken man, but I hoped that he would find a way to rebuild his life, to make amends for the damage he had caused. As for us, we began the slow process of healing. The house felt different, quieter, without the constant tension that had hung over it since Lily's return. We packed up Grandma's things, sorting through memories and mementos, finding solace in the pieces of her life that remained. Dad and I stood in the living room one evening, surrounded by boxes, and he looked at me with a weary smile. "Thank you, Aaron," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. "We did it for Grandma. She would have wanted us to fight for her." As we closed up the house, I knew that we were closing a chapter, one that had been filled with pain and betrayal, but also with resilience and love. We had defended our family's honor, and though the scars would remain, we were stronger for it. In the end, we chose to sell the house, using the money to start a charitable foundation in Grandma's name. It was a way to honor her memory, to keep her spirit alive in a way that Lily could never touch. And as I walked away from that house for the last time, I felt a sense of closure, knowing that we had done the right thing. We had faced down the storm and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. And I knew that, whatever the future held, we would face it together, with the strength and love that Grandma had always taught us. The trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a test of our family's resilience and a fight for the legacy of someone we loved. By the time we walked into the courtroom, we were all running on little more than nerves and a shared determination to see justice served. Lily sat at the defendant's table, looking as poised as ever, but there was a hardness in her eyes, a look that told me she wasn't sorry for any of it. She only regretted getting caught. The trial dragged on for days, with both sides presenting their cases. Lily's lawyer tried to paint her as the estranged daughter, returned to claim what was rightfully hers. He argued that she had every reason to believe Grandma would have wanted her to inherit the estate, that perhaps Grandma had felt guilty about the way things had turned out. But the jury wasn't buying it. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions, and Lily's blatant arrogance only worked against her. The real turning point came when Jonathan Carter, the executor of the will, took the stand. He looked smaller than I remembered, hunched over with a look of defeat on his face. He glanced over at us, and I saw a flicker of remorse in his eyes. Linda, our lawyer, questioned him, pressing him on the details of his involvement with Lily. He resisted at first, clinging to the lie, but Linda was relentless, using every piece of evidence we had gathered to paint him into a corner. Finally, he broke down. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She paid me. I was in debt, and she offered to help if I forged the will. I knew it was wrong, but I needed the money." The courtroom was silent, everyone absorbing the weight of his confession. I saw Lily's face pale, her confidence cracking as the reality of her situation sank in. But she didn't flinch. She maintained that icy demeanor, as if daring the world to challenge her. When Lily took the stand, she tried to control the narrative. She spoke with a calmness that was almost chilling, framing herself as the victim of a family that had abandoned her. She recounted her years of struggle, painting a picture of a woman forced to fend for herself because her family had turned their backs on her. She made it sound almost convincing, but I knew better. We all did. Linda didn't hold back. She exposed every lie, every exaggeration, every manipulation that Lily had used to twist the truth. By the time she finished cross-examining Lily, there was nothing left of her story. She was just a desperate woman trying to take advantage of a family that had once loved her, and the jury could see that. But the most painful moment for me came when Dad took the stand. He'd spent so many years hiding his feelings, locking away the pain that Lily had caused. Now, it was all out in the open. He spoke about their childhood, about the good times before Lily left, and about the way her disappearance had shattered their mother. His voice broke when he talked about Grandma, about how much she'd suffered, and I could see that he was holding back tears. "She was my sister," he said, looking directly at Lily. "I loved her, even when she hurt us. I would have welcomed her back with open arms if she'd just come home. But she didn't want a family. She wanted what she could take. And that's not something I can forgive." Lily met his gaze, her expression cold and unfeeling. I felt a pang of sorrow, realizing that she wasn't going to back down, not even now. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was swift: guilty on all counts of fraud and forgery. The judge sentenced Lily to 5 years in prison, and while it wasn't as long as I'd hoped, it was enough to bring a sense of justice. Jonathan received a suspended sentence, a consequence of his cooperation, and he left the courtroom with a hollow look, like a man who had lost everything. As they led Lily away, she looked back at us, her eyes filled with a venom that sent a chill down my spine. "You think this is over?" she hissed, her voice low and full of menace. "I'll never forgive you for this. You'll regret it, all of you." I wanted to shout back, to tell her that we'd done what was right, but I knew it wouldn't matter. She was too far gone, too wrapped up in her own bitterness to see the truth. And maybe, in a way, I did regret it. Not the trial, not the fight, but the fact that it had come to this. That our family had been torn apart by greed and resentment, leaving behind nothing but scars. The drive home was quiet. Dad and I didn't say much, both of us lost in our own thoughts. It felt surreal, like we'd just survived a storm that had left everything around us shattered. I knew that we'd won, that we'd protected Grandma's legacy, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like we'd barely escaped with our lives. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the trial in my head, the things that had been said, the looks on their faces. I thought about Lily, about the way she'd thrown everything away, and I wondered if things could have been different. If we could have saved her, somehow. But I knew it was too late for that. She had made her choices, and we'd all paid the price. The next morning, Dad and I sat down over breakfast, the silence stretching between us like an unspoken question. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes tired but resolute. "We need to move on, Aaron," he said, his voice heavy. "For your grandma. We can't let this destroy us." I nodded, knowing he was right. We had to find a way to let go, to put the past behind us. It wouldn't be easy, but we owed it to ourselves and to Grandma to try. Over the next few weeks, we started packing up the house, sorting through Grandma's things and deciding what to keep and what to let go. It was a painful process, but it was also healing, in a way. We found old photographs, letters, and mementos that reminded us of better times, of the love that had once held our family together. In the end, we decided to sell the house. It was too full of memories, too tied to everything that had happened. But we didn't want to just let it go. We used the proceeds to set up a charitable foundation in Grandma's name, something that would honor her legacy and keep her spirit alive. It was a way to give back, to create something positive out of all the pain. The day we closed on the house, Dad and I stood in the empty living room, looking around one last time. It felt strange, like we were saying goodbye not just to the house but to a part of ourselves. But it also felt like a new beginning, a chance to start over. As we walked out the door, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. We had faced the worst and come through it, stronger and more united. We'd lost something along the way, but we'd also gained something, an understanding of who we were and of what really mattered. I don't know if I'll ever see Lily again. I don't know if she'll ever find forgiveness, or if she'll even want it. But I do know that I'm done with her, done with the lies and the betrayal. I have my family, my memories of Grandma, and the strength that comes from knowing we did the right thing. And that's enough for me. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.